So this is a presentation about policing landscapes for the rule of law and public protection. I'm Dr. Peter Neyroud. I'm from the Institute of Criminology in the University of Cambridge. And the piece of work that I'm going to talk to was commissioned by the National Academy of Sciences as part of a program which is ongoing about the evidence that might help to advance reform in global security. It's an incredibly important topic, particularly in a world that's struggling to cope with and to emerge from the COVID pandemic. But it's also a really tough topic to look at from an evidence-based perspective. As will become clear as I go through this, this was a really tricky commission to answer, not the least of which, because most of what we talk about in evidence-based policing, we start from a point of view of an intervention, and we think about the type of approaches, usually often experimental, that can be used to test an intervention, and things like observational data and ethnographic data to understand what's been going on inside the experiment. And within that confined territory, it's possible to understand an awful lot about what works and to be able to replicate it and apply it in a different context. Policing landscapes, by which we mean, or the National Academy of Sciences meant, looking at a total national picture or indeed an international picture, is a much more difficult thing to encompass in an evidence-based approach, not the least of which, as will become clear as I go through this presentation, there's not a whole host of evidence about what works on a national scale. And if we think back to what we know, for example, about interventions like hotspot policing, even in an area like that where there's a considerable body of evidence, more than 80 experimental studies, for example, there's still a shortage of evidence about what works on a larger scale. For example, there are few, if any, studies about what might happen in a whole jurisdiction, a large city, if hotspot policing was applied across that whole city. And when you magnify that up in terms of looking at the rule of law and public protection and the evidence on organizational policies, structures, and human resources, which was my brief, it becomes even more challenging. So bear with me as we go through this. And what I'm going to try and do, apart from introducing the rule of law and its concepts and definitions, I'll start from some of the models on police reform, which are particularly pertinent to the debates that have been taking place across the world about how to reform policing, whether policing should be defunded or even abolished, what policing does that adds value, and therefore on what basis should you reform. The evidence review was not a systematic review. It would have been just too vast a task, certainly for one individual to undertake. It was I would best describe it as a purposive review. I followed the evidence and I used as many of the systematic reviews and overviews that are available across the world in as many languages as I could manage. I don't claim this is the last word on this subject. That would be foolish. But I think it's a pretty good picture of the state of evidence as it is. And what I've tried to do I'll do as we cover this ground, is to give a summary of where I think the evidence lies and why it lies in that territory, and then link it to two other pieces of research that I've been doing whilst we've been enduring this pandemic. The first of which is a piece of work that's looked at the impact of on policing of the pandemic and the ways in which police organizations have sought to respond. That piece of work, which has been done with my colleagues Sanja Ivkovic and John Mascali from the States, is on its fourth or fifth piece of work based on survey work that we did shortly after the first wave of the pandemic, and we're in the process of completing surveys on the third wave as well, so to try and get some sort of longitudinal perspective on the impact of policing. But it's entirely pertinent to the issues of the rule of law, because the extent to which policing has been asked to adopt an enforcement role in support of public health outcomes has absolutely trod into the territory of rule of law, and above all into the territory of the legitimacy of those seeking to use enforcement as part of a public health brief. And I've also been doing a piece of work for the United Nations Organization for Drugs and Crime, UNODC, which has looked at community policing as a potential post-COVID strategy. As will become clear as the presentation rolls on, community policing is one of the more promising areas for sustaining rule of law. Rule of law is not an entirely consensual topic, but I've started with the United Nations definitions, and you'll see it's set out there. The rule of law is a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws, and that's really the critical part of it. And if we look at the one of the sponsors of the National Academy of Sciences review, USAID, they set out what they consider to be 5 key elements of the rule of law. The first being a state of order and security. In a sense, this goes to the heart of the role of policing. Without order and security, it's difficult to police. Policing, in a sense, comes post-conflict as a means of restoring and creating normality. Legitimacy, the strong sense that the state and the police force, in this case, enjoy support and feel that they have the ability to carry out their duties. A system of checks and balances that supports that, and in particular, a system to hold law enforcement officials to account for treading across the boundaries of law and treading across the boundaries of international standards. Fairness, which very strongly links with legitimacy, in particular, that there is an equal application of the law, that equal application is supported by procedural fairness, that also ensures the protection of basic human rights and civil liberties, and of course ensures that people have equal and open access to justice. The last one actually is really important, that actually things work, that law enforcement is effectively applied, not just fairly applied. Indeed, in Justice Tankerby and Tony Bottom's work on legitimacy, they argue very strongly that it's fine to emphasize procedural fairness, but actually policing, law enforcement has to actually be effective or be perceived to be so for it to be legitimate. The rule of law concepts link very strongly to the not very large but important body of work that's been done on models for police reform. The most important piece of work for me, undoubtedly, is that was conducted over 60 years by David Bailey. I had the privilege of working with David on the program that we conducted at the National Police Academy of India over a decade. And David's work is based on an important body of comparative policing work across a whole range of different countries and contexts, ranging from his work in India and Japan and the Far East in the 1960s and 70s to work with the Patten Commission in Northern Ireland in the post-peace agreement and the attempts to reform and change the Northern Ireland police force. What David distilled out of that work was a set of principles about what effective police reform might look like. They clearly link to the definition I've just run through from USA, but I think they're an incredibly important framework to think about when you're thinking about strategies for organizational change in policing and for long-term policing reform. He starts from a clear peg in the ground, which is that there needs to be a legal framework for policing. This turns out to be an incredibly important starting point when we start to think about what's been happening with the policing of COVID-19, where the legal framework, in particular the way in which short-term enforcement regulations have been promulgated by governments across the world, turns out to have been a really quite a serious problem, not just for the police, who quite often got legal requirements at very short notice, but also for the public, who needed to obey them, who were frequently unaware of the detail of regulations. And this, by the way, was not simply a problem for the UK and the US. In the 28 countries that we surveyed, we found that the legal framework and its clarity was a serious problem for both police and the public. David then focused on independent oversight, the importance that there should be an independent body with a level of oversight on the priorities and practices of policing. Policing needed to recruit and retain the right sort of people, and in a sense, that's an important way of helping the police to think about what it is exactly that they're trying to achieve. Only by being focused on what the mission is and thinking about the types of people and the types of values that they need to bring with them, can you start down the route of recruiting and retaining the right sort of people. Developing the capacity of police executives to manage reform. Often in police forces, we focus an awful lot of time and effort on recruitment and maybe on the training of first-line supervisors, and completely insufficient attention to the capacity of police executives to manage the organisation, and above all to manage its transition, reform and change. Making prevention of crime the primary focus. One of David's most important principles in this is that the police force, to be effective and to secure legitimacy, needs to always have the individual citizen in mind. And the primary task should always be the prevention of crime and the maintenance of order, looked at from the perspective of the individual citizen. Only that way, in a democratic society, does policing have a chance of securing the level of legitimacy necessary to encourage compliance and to secure support from the public. Last but not least, linking with the rule of law definition from USAID, a requirement for the police to act legally and to behave fairly. In looking across the field of evidence, I mean, normally when we're talking about evidence-based policing, we're starting with the Maryland scale and thinking about systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials, experimental studies with controls in them, and then working our way down to descriptive and before and after studies. In a field of where you're looking at organizational purposes, structure and accountability, those types of design are a luxury. Quite often what you're looking at in the evidence is comparative studies looking across different jurisdictions. Importantly, historical studies, and I think it's important not to underestimate the importance of careful, thoughtful, historical understandings of why decisions and why changes have been made in policing, not the least of which we continuously refer to Peel's principles in English-speaking policing, and indeed they've become almost common currency across the world without anyone really paying close attention as to whether Peel actually had any part in defining them. And in doing so, of course, we miss the critically important role that the first two commissioners of the Metropolitan Police, Rowan and Main, played in their drafting and implementation. And by doing so, we're focusing much of our effort on understanding those early principles in the wrong place. Then we've got case studies, and the case study can be a very important way of understanding something and illustrating that something has gone on. They are more troubling when it comes to the external validity, looking across different jurisdictions. There are a variety of mixed method reform studies and a few, mostly in the area of technology, such as body-worn cameras, a few experimental studies that are relevant in this area. What becomes clear when you look across the literature is the points I've set out on the right-hand side of this slide. Firstly, that the balance between military and civilian models matters. In the historical studies of policing, police historians like Clive Emsley have documented well the difference between fundamental difference between different models of policing. So, for example, between the state military model, such as the gendarmerie in France, for example, and the municipal civilian models that are the dominant model in, for example, the United States and within the UK. For a start, a state military model, the mission and purpose of the police is set at the centre. It's fundamentally about maintaining order, whereas in contrast, the municipal civilian model has local objectives and much more of a focus on the citizen. So the history of police forces matters, and it influences their mission, their culture, and the approach that they take to interpreting the requirements of the rule of law. Quite often in the debate, we miss the difference between low and high policing. Those two terms particularly coming from the work of Jean-Paul Brodeur, the Canadian policing scholar. Low policing being fundamentally the local level of policing focused on crime prevention and the local maintenance of order. High policing, such things as the prevention of terrorist acts, dealing with national security, territory that is still very much in the domain of policing, but is much more governed at the centre. There is a growing debate around the applicability of principles of the rule of law to transnational policing, and in particular a concern about the accountability void, not the least of which because quite a lot of what is transnational policing happens out of sight and out of the purview of national bodies for accountability. Fourth point that's important is the worldwide promulgation of a decentralized community policing model. It's a critical part, of course, of a municipal civilian approach in many countries and in many places, but it's also an extremely important example of a philosophy and approach to policing that starts from the citizen and works back to the organisation rather than the organisation dictating the terms of engagement. That in itself provides a different framework for the implementation of rule of law principles, and it has promise in terms of sustainability by building in a natural process of accountability coming from the ground up, and in particular the process of setting priorities and determining the way in which the police may make their choices. Finally, there's the issue which is very current at the moment about whether the route to police reform, and in particular the route to changing the way the police operate, is one of tabula rasa, i.e. tabula rasa being derived from the Roman process of writing on wax tablets, tabula, the tablet, and rasa meaning erased or scrubbed, because the wax was scrubbed across to remove the writing. And in this case, the tabula rasa approach implies the complete replacement or removal of a particular underperforming or unreformed police force by a completely different agency. And the question is that a sensible strategy? In terms of the areas where we have, as it were, the more obvious evidence-based approaches, the technology is the one where we have the most significant evidence, particularly in an experimental sense. And the most obvious example of this, which is relevant to the rule of law, is the work on body-worn cameras, which has recently been incorporated into a systematic review by Cynthia Lum and colleagues. What's interesting about the systematic review, which I would encourage anyone interested in this territory to read carefully, is that the literature is far from clear on the effects, but what it is clear on is that whatever effects can be achieved by body-worn cameras has a huge dependency on decisions that senior policymakers and practitioners make about how to implement and deploy body-worn cameras. The studies show that there was not a consistent or significant effect on officers' use of force, on arrest activities, proactive or self-initiated activities, or as it says, or other measured behaviours. But if you start looking at the variables such as the extent to which deployment policies enforced the body-worn camera to be always on, and the extent to which body-worn cameras were and their usage were tracked, they have a huge impact on the extent to which the body-worn camera has an impact on use of force, has an impact on the way in which officers behave, and then an increasing number of new studies focusing on the extent to which evidence can be gathered from body-worn cameras. The importance of good guidance, good training, and good tracking and follow-up are absolutely critical. In terms of the tabula rasa approach, the studies that are there are mostly case studies. And I've cited three particular examples here, one from Georgia, another from Peru, and the third from the United States in Camden, New Jersey. I have to say, as you read these studies through, it's far from clear that actually the studies demonstrate a genuine abolition and replacement or reformation. For example, the much quoted American study of Camden, New Jersey is far from abolition. It's far more properly described as amalgamation. Essentially, Camden, New Jersey was, which is the police force that's on the opposite bank of the river from Philadelphia, was struggling to cope with rising levels of street crime and robbery and homicide, with a very significantly reduced number of officers because of tax issues. It was amalgamated with a larger county area to create a single force. In UK terms, that was a process that was adopted in 1967 with the amalgamation of over 100 police forces into 43. It doesn't configure to abolition. It didn't require the removal of every officer. In Georgia, there was a substantial replacement of one police force by another, but again, a significant number of officers moved across from the one to the other. And the example quoted from Peru is fundamentally about the replacement of a particular traffic policing function. The contexts of these different studies are clearly important. In Camden, New Jersey, it's important to think about the municipal governance and taxation issues that faced policing officials. In Georgia, it was a time of very significant governmental change and an overhaul. And Peru had its own particular problems with corruption. All of those contexts clearly not only influenced the way in which the tabula rasa abolition approach was adopted, but also the way in which that change either improved or did not improve the outcomes. The only one that has any significant evidence of sustained improvement is the amalgamation in Camden, New Jersey. The others, there have not been significant and important follow-ups. And those examples very much connect with the literature, such as it is on accountability and checks and balances. There is in the literature, and probably the most important piece of work in this is the work of the American academic Herbert, who's looked at community policing in this context, where he documented the balance that needs to be maintained and observed with care between political direction, as he termed it, subservience, and professional leadership. And in that area, he cited the idea of the concept of separation and the constant tension and balance between subservience and separation. What much of the literature misses and doesn't, and this is putting a professional hat as a former chief on, is the stability of leadership. There have been a number of studies looking at the changes that have taken place in the United Kingdom with the substitution of a police authority of local elected members with a single elected official, a police and crime commissioner. One of the things that's happened as a result of that is a very significant increase in the instability of leadership and a shortening of the leadership term of chief officers. Two things immediately happen as a result of that, one of which is the corpus of senior leadership across a country like the United Kingdom will inevitably have a reduced level of experience and a reduced level of leadership time in which to make changes. And secondly, it makes it really difficult for the leadership, with knowing that lack of stability, to be able to sustain improvement over time. And the example quoted on the right-hand side is an example from India, where there is an increasing body of literature, and in particular literature from the Indian Police Foundation, that's focused on the problems that have been created by the failure to implement reforms that gave greater stability to senior police leadership and greater separation of that leadership from direct political interference and political direction. In terms of organisational policies and practices for which there is evidence to sustain the rule of law, seemed, as in looking across this, that probably the two strongest areas were evidence-based policing and community policing, of which only community policing can claim to have been achieved or to have been studied, at least at a national level in terms of implementation. And that particularly relates to the implementation of the neighbourhood policing programme in England and Wales in the decade from 2004 onwards. In terms of evidence-based policing, we haven't got examples of whole nations, or yet got examples of whole nations implementing evidence-based policing as a fundamental part of the philosophy, and that process being subjected to effective evidence-based scrutiny. But we have got, critically, the understanding of why evidence-based policing might be incredibly important in that respect. It's the emphasis that the EBP places on the least intrusive intervention to accomplish the most benefit, which is so fundamental to the rule of law, because lying behind the rule of law principles are the idea that the law should be used as little as possible to accomplish its aims, and what policing should be seeking to do is to secure support, encourage compliance rather than adopt enforcement. That became an incredibly important part of the approach of a number of countries to the enforcement of the public health regulations under COVID. There is limited evidence as yet as to whether adopting that type of minimalist and legitimacy-based approach is more effective than others, but there's very little evidence that a more restrictive approach has been more effective in reducing infection. In terms of community policing, the review that I did for the UNODC surprised me in terms of, firstly, the number of studies that I was able to discover, randomized control trials in particular, that have been conducted both in the global north and the global south, with a level of consistency of outcome in terms of community policing, particularly incorporating problem-oriented approaches, being effective in both securing greater legitimacy for the police, but also in reducing crime and disorder. The evidence from the National Restoring Reassurance Project that became the Neighbourhood Policing Programme in the UK is an important example of achieving a nationwide, national approach to the issue. And given that neighbourhood policing fundamentally demands a high level of accountability to the community, it requires a focus on equity of delivery and fairness in delivery, and it particularly demands a consistency of application across the country. If you're going to introduce a national basis, it's an potentially incredibly important strategy for sustaining the rule of law. It would also need to link with the legal frameworks that David Bailey talked up. And here it's much more difficult to secure evidence of the effectiveness of legal frameworks. After all, few governments actually undertake studies to test the effectiveness of legal frameworks. The political framework tends to create the frameworks and expect the police to get on and make them operate. And the most obvious framework that's been studied over time has been the creation of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act in England and Wales, where we've got post-implementation evaluation, 10 years on and now 20 years on, looking at the effectiveness of the approach, which is a highly regulated approach to detention, to interviewing, to search and identification, looking at the extent to which those issues have been implemented. And we've got a number of studies that have taken that and a number of other legal frameworks from other countries and sought to test them in as clear a way as they can by looking at aspects of the interviewing, aspects of the search approaches, and aspects of the identification approaches. In fact, probably of those four, identification has had the most testing, and particularly with a number of RCTs in the United States looking at different approaches to identification. But there is little doubt of the importance of legal frameworks. Just the clarity of the evidence is not so strong. What we can be clear about, however, is it's easier to regulate what goes on inside the police station and to regulate formal processes such as search and identification than it is to regulate street powers like the use of stop and search or stop and frisk. Those are much more problematic to regulate. It may be that that's changing with body-worn cameras, which provide a level of transparency, as long as, back to the evidence from the systematic review, there's a strong emphasis on the ways in which the use of body-worn cameras are actually used, tracked, and followed up. Likewise, with a number of countries that have experienced problems with the regulation of and oversight of undercover policing and surveillance, and probably the latter, surveillance in particular, is likely to become a more and more important issue. There are few, if any, credible evaluations of the effectiveness of oversight and of legislation in this area. Same could be said of much of the areas of leadership, management, and human resources. Probably the most important and probably the most important area, and the one in which the evidence is growing steadily, is the extent to which it matters that there is effectively an emphasis on rule of law inside the organisation as well as out of it. The work that's been done both in the United States and the United Kingdom on procedural justice inside the police organisation suggests, and this is particularly work that's been done by scholars such as Ben Bradford and Paul Quinton in Durham Police in the UK, that does indicate that there is a strong connection between perceptions by police officers that they are being treated fairly and their likelihood of treating the public fairly and following through with a high quality of service. It seems fairly obvious, but it's an important one to be able to demonstrate, and it's not a simple connection. Slightly more troubling is given that the scale of the challenge in recruiting to policing. There's a lot of countries at the moment seeking to recruit police officers, and a lot of countries that are struggling to recruit police officers despite the post-COVID employment markets. But in particular, the challenge of recruiting the right people is particularly difficult. Looking at the evidence on the recruitment of police officers, given that for a considerable period of time I was responsible for the recruitment processes in the United Kingdom, it is a meagre and disappointing set of evidence. Mostly, I think, because we've failed to be thoughtful about really good longitudinal work on the people that we recruit and looking at their careers over a longer period of time. The extent to which, for example, recruiting people with graduate qualifications necessarily translates into better outcomes. The evidence is equivocal, possibly promising, but equivocal. And given that I wrote a review of police training and leadership for the UK government, it is disappointing that the evidence hasn't improved since that review in 2011. When we look at things like the diversity and equality strategies, the evidence is still thin, despite the level of emphasis that we've got on improving things. Some of the areas look promising. So, for example, there have been a number of studies on using women's police stations to tackle the underreporting of serious sexual assault and domestic violence, particularly in the global south. Those studies are promising. I have to say that's as much as we can say about the strength of the studies, given that they're not experimental. But studies, for example, on whether minority representation in policing delivers better rule of law outcomes are really disappointing, when, despite the level of importance that is attached to getting a more representative police force. When it comes to complaints investigation and independent oversight, again, for something that is seen as so important, the evidence is far from clear. The quote I've got on the right-hand side is from a study of accountability and complaints investigations that was done for USAID, and the authors sought to review the global evidence and basically came up with very little that they thought was compelling and helpful in guiding approaches to how to devise and develop independent oversight. Little information as to the effectiveness of either internal affairs, professional standards, or external civilian oversight bodies as methods of enhancing police accountability. The one thing that does look promising, or appears to be promising, and in particular from studies that have looked at things like bribery and corruption, are the importance of independent audit, an example of which it might be the inspectorate system in the United Kingdom, for example, and there are a number of other inspectorate offices around the world that might provide similar evidence. Essentially, the outside-in view from an independent, so this is going back to David Bailey's approach, looks promising, but I say the studies are not as good as you would think, given the importance that's often attached in reform literature to this particular area. One of the things that I was asked to do for the National Academy of Sciences paper was to think about the types of data, the tracking information, to go back to Larry Sherman's triple T of targeting, testing and tracking. What would the tracking data for the rule of law look like? And this table is an attempt to think about some of the things that you might want to have in that tracking model. So, on the right, and what I've done is to try and put it into 4 levels: the neighbourhood level, local command level, a police agency level, and national policing level. So again, respecting the divisions of policing that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, the difference between low and high policing, for example, and the differences between the very local and local. and then thinking about the types of function, what type of audit and inspection role might be appropriate, the sort of data that might be important to focus on, ranging from data about effectiveness to data about the types of processes such as criminal justice outcomes and complaints and misconduct that you might focus on, and the places where that data might be translated into public accountability and might be made transparently available so that there can be an outside-in approach, both from independent bodies and also from the public. In summarising, because I was asked to provide an overview of what worked in this particular area, and I've used the original Maryland report approach of what works, what's promising, and what appears not to work. The only area that is in green because there is good evidence that it works, and it works at a national level, is community policing, particularly community policing linked to problem-oriented policing. And then in the yellow, promising, on the left-hand side, promising is an evidence-based approach to reduce harm by targeting, testing, and tracking. And then on the right-hand side, and I put that under what works on the basis that we know it works. It's the limitation why it's in yellow is that we can't demonstrate that it works on a whole national approach yet. On the right-hand side, what's promising? Well, legal regulation is both promising and important. Cognitive and investigative interviewing, there's a significant body of evidence supporting it as a way of interviewing and going about the interviewing of both offenders and victims and witnesses. Body-worn cameras, as long as implemented properly. Focused audit, so the concept of some form of external inspection. Procedural justice, and actually in the literature as well, linked to that is restorative justice, and particularly applied inside the organisation as well. What's weak and what backfires? Well, the legal regulation of street powers is weak. The screening of recruits, the evidence is weak. The creation of a representative police force, the evidence is weak. What backfires is having very short tenures and insecure appointments of chief officers and senior officers. There's weak evidence on the different models of policing, weak on a defunding abolitionist approach. Interestingly, which I haven't touched on in the presentation so far, but there's a lot of emphasis placed in the literature on complaints on early warning systems and not particularly good evidence of whether they work or not. There are significant gaps on what works in police accountability, and there are significant gaps on the effectiveness of different models of internal investigation, professional standards, and civilian oversight. And those seem to me to be incredibly important topics, but insufficiently evidenced in the literature. What we definitely need in this area, and I speak now as the co-chair of the Campbell Crime and Justice Group, is we need an evidence and gap map on the type of policing interventions that might sustain the rule of law, so that we can more comprehensively understand the evidence. As one individual researcher looking at this area, it is such a huge area to summarise that I've only touched the surface. I can't do the whole of it justice. But a team using the type of research techniques that we now use to support systematic evidence could provide a really important level of knowledge for us and give us a place to start whenever we're trying to answer these questions. Why is this important? Well, we've just been through the largest, longest, most complicated major incident in policing since the Second World War, and in that process we've learned, well, we haven't yet learned because we haven't yet published enough of the research, but we've begun to learn some of the limitations and some of the issues to do with policing stepping so overtly into the territory of enforcing public health in this case. Policing, in the work that Sanya, John and I have done, we surveyed police forces across the world. We had 28 detailed responses from, well, we had more than 28 responses, but 28 countries responded. And we analysed those responses, and these were primarily responses to the first phase of the pandemic. And we've begun to analyse responses from the second and third phases with large-scale surveys of police officers and citizens. Policing has had, in that course of that time, to socially distance itself. And one of the implications of that is that it has actually taken out a great many of the community policing functions. You can't do face-to-face policing, community policing, when you're trying to socially distance. Given that I've just explained how important community policing is as a strategy for sustaining rule of law, there are huge implications from not being able to conduct normal community policing operations. And indeed, we were able to document an increased deployment of specialist public order units, some of which may well relate to some of the protests, post the death of George Floyd, for example, some of which may relate to protests about anti-vax protests about the policing of restrictions. But quite a lot of it appears to relate to taking the opportunity presented by the pandemic to carry out a much more restrictive level of policing. The kind of rule of law issues that emerged were the general experience of the frenetic pace of change in policy and procedures, and critically, without any external scrutiny of the regulations. Speaking as a member of the scientific advisory group in the UK, just the extraordinary process of layer upon layer of regulation being imposed at very, very short notice in a very uncoordinated fashion, clearly without significant legislative scrutiny. Not good practice, but an almost universal experience. Unclear, muddled requirements which were rushed out and poorly communicated. And the changes from the police officers who were responding to our survey, and these were senior police officers across the world, this quote on the right-hand side was almost a universal requirement. The changes that were necessary should be communicated in as clear and succinct a manner as possible, so that the people who are responsible for enforcing these changes know more precisely what they're meant to be doing. Really, really important that the police themselves understand clearly what it is they're being asked to do, why they're being asked to do it, and what outcomes they're expected to achieve from doing it. That was not the case across many of the countries that we surveyed. And the implications of that are that what we've seen with COVID-19 is a very significant, and hope maybe temporary, but I suspect there are some longer term issues, relationship between the police and the public. The pandemic has accelerated changes to police demand management, for example. A lot of police forces have been able and taken advantage of the hiatus from the pandemic to push forward on changes to the way in which they manage demand. Leadership now has to think about how and what and why to retain some of those changes, some of which were effective and some of which may well not have been. They need to think about how to deal with some of the problems that have shifted in the 18 months. So, for example, cybercrime, which the police are really not doing very well at tackling, and which very significantly challenges the national jurisdiction, which is the basis of most policing systems across the world. Cybercrime absolutely needs a fresh and more vigorous approach from police, and one in which the police clearly understand how they position themselves against both the rule of law, but also against the network of other organizations and methods, to the network of prevention, which will enable cybercrime to be reduced and controlled. In a post-COVID world, the likelihood is that terrorism and radicalization are going to be a more significant problem. The Camel Collaboration and a number of the countries, a number of the major countries across the world have been trying to get together the best evidence about what works to tackle terrorism and radicalization. that has a huge link with strategies to sustain the rule of law, because the type of strategies that are traditionally taken to tackle terrorism, for example, widespread use of stop and search and arrest powers, widespread use of powers at airports and transport hubs, for example, have very significant implications for the relationship between the police and the citizen. Being clear about which of the various strategies works is an extraordinarily important part of the way in which the policing in democratic countries copes with the challenge without losing the values of the rule of law. And last but not least, rebuilding the legitimacy of police forces in a post-COVID world, it is clear to me, and it was clear in the review I did for the UNODC, that community policing is absolutely central strategy in a post-COVID world. Thank you.
Well, hello, Peter, and thank you very much for that presentation. We really appreciate your the time that you've taken to participate in the Australian New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing Conference. So, Peter, you've been in this game for 41 years. You've seen a lot of change over time. But what has really sustained your interest in the rule of law?
Well, I joined as a young police officer in 1980, and the very first thing I did in policing, other than be a frontline cop, was to design a community policing scheme for the first force I was in, Hampshire. 40 odd years on, it became apparent to me that the one thing in looking at this evidence review that really sustained the rule of law was the very thing that I'd started out at, which was community policing, which was fundamentally about the police listening to its public, about a level of transparency and openness, responding. And one of our closest friends in criminology, David Bailey, pointed out that the one thing that police had to do was pay attention to individual citizens' concerns. And that was at the heart of reform, that the moment the police became simply focused on the needs of the state, they lost that individual concern. And with it, that concern about the rights, the liberties, the sense of belonging that is so critical in a democracy and so important for a police force, that the public feels is on their side. And that thread has run right the way through my career, concerned with things like ethics, things with the concerns about human rights in police and policing, concerns about the ways in which police use lethal force, because I led on police firearms in the UK, and more recently evidence-based policing, because fundamentally for me evidence-based policing is about the police doing as little as they need to do in order to have the maximum impact, and that seems to me to be absolutely fundamental to a democracy.
Great, thank you, Peter. So I noticed in your presentation that you talked about the importance of leadership stability, and I'd just like you to elaborate on this point a little bit.
It's the issue of leadership stability for me has become more and more important as I've broadened out from the UK, because for a long time in the UK we had enormous stability in senior leadership, a lot of chiefs who did 10, 15 years of service. And actually, one of the things that we were critical of, as those of us who were coming up through the organisation, was the stasis, the overstability of leadership. And then we've switched to a situation with elected police leaders, police and crime commissioners, where that switchover has happened to the extent that we now have 18 months to 2 years maximum stability in the UK, and it completely destabilizes the ability to drive the kind of long-term changes that things like community. You can't do police reform in 18 months, because anyone who doesn't believe in the police reform will wait you out. The minute that the people who don't want to change can see that all they have to do is wait for 18 months to 2 years for the next one in. And we know this from the literature. We know this from the work of James Q. Wilson back in the 1960s, that the fast rotating leadership in policing is a recipe for no reform, and for hard changes not being made and deep issues not being confronted. And there's never been a moment in policing in my 41 years where policing has needed that kind of long-term sustained change more. Faced with a kind of range of challenges from terrorism through to changing its diversity profile, through to getting closer to citizens. I mean, in the midst of a pandemic that has rocked all sorts of the stabilities in society, the police and their ability to adapt and change are absolutely front and centre of that.
You talk about the importance of independent oversight, which of course is so fundamental to fostering legitimacy and for the community to have trust in the police. And we know that when we don't have that sort of oversight, then people don't trust the process, they don't trust the police. So, but what about where you do have high levels of legitimacy already? How important is that independent oversight, and is there a sweet spot, if you like, with having the right amount of oversight and the right amount of internal investigations of policing matters?
Well, one of the things that came through in the evidence review was that inspection and audit is one of the more promising areas of driving police reform. And as a chief, I never was particularly keen on being inspected. It's never a pleasant process having your homework marked to that extent. But I would never have been as good a chief had I not had that external oversight and the discomfort of being pushed and challenged by somebody. I mean, it needed to be somebody I respected, because that's one of the challenges. It does matter who the inspection process and the oversight process is. There's two different questions here. There's the technical questions that a formal inspector can ask, and you kind of only need one of those. And you need to be asked, the technical questions about how and why you're using money and resources for particular purposes, and whether you're actually following through on what you said you were going to do. And that's the kind of external tracking. If we go back to Larry Sherman's Triple T, that's the kind of external tracking that keeps you honest and keeps the challenge going. And then there's the kind of institutional process of elected members, external bodies challenging you. And there, I think the issue is being the good external oversight is really clear about what it's trying to achieve, what its role is. It's not trying to second guess a chief. It's trying to elicit explanation, hold to account, encourage you to come up to the mark when you said you're going to do something, and also to be a voice, an external voice, expressing the vision, the values of a community. And if it does that, it really enhances policing. If all that it does is simply raise controversy and make life difficult. And there are examples. I mean, Northern Ireland has got to the extent there are so many voices of oversight that Hugh Ward said it was impossible to keep track of them when he was the chief. And that just becomes noise in the machine, whereas good oversight keeps you focused. It also, by the way, it helps you through the next, because policing you will always move from one challenge to the next, and sometimes one critical moment to the next. Good external oversight can also provide support by asking questions at the right moment and asking them in the right way, so that the public can see that you're being held to account and don't feel the need to be shouting at you because someone is doing that for them and they're raising those points with you. And policing needs that kind of challenge and as it goes through difficult moments.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter, for this fireside chat. I've really enjoyed talking to you and listening to your presentation. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for participating in the Australian New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing. And hopefully we'll see you in person sometime soon. Thank you.